Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story. Tonight, imagine standing on a windswept cliff beneath a sky crowded with stars, the sea stretching endlessly into darkness, while distant waves whisper secrets nobody has quite managed to explain. Somewhere beyond that horizon, according to old rumors, lay the very edge of the world, not a kingdom. Not a hidden island full of treasure. The actual end of everything. People thought they knew. Now, sensible people usually hear a tale like that and immediately decide to stay home with a warm supper. But sensible people rarely become the subjects of stories. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know where you're listening from and what the local hour is. It's always fascinating to imagine listeners scattered across distant places, all gathered around the same tale. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There once was a man named Aldrich, a traveler whose greatest talent was being dissatisfied with ordinary answers. He had crossed forests thick enough to swallow roads whole. He had climbed mountains where goats seemed better equipped than people. He had sailed rivers so winding that a person could leave home, heading north, and somehow arrive from the south. Yet no matter how far he traveled, one question continued bothering him. Where did the world end? Most people laughed when he asked. Some pointed toward the horizon and said, "There." Others pointed toward the nearest tavern and suggested he spend less time listening to sailors. A few simply shrugged. But Aldrich noticed something curious. The people who laughed the loudest often lowered their voices afterward. And whenever old sailors spoke among themselves after too much ale, strange fragments of stories emerged. Stories about waters beyond known charts. Stories about cliffs that touched the sky. Stories about stars that changed position. Stories about travelers who left and never returned. Naturally, hearing all of this only made Aldrich more interested. This was, unfortunately, how his mind worked. If somebody told him a road was dangerous, he wanted to see it. If somebody claimed a cave was haunted, he wanted to explore it. If somebody said, "Absolutely, do not go there," he began packing before they finished the sentence. You might call that bravery. His friends called it a deeply exhausting personality trait. One autumn evening, while staying in a coastal town battered by sea winds, Aldrich met an old mapmaker. The man occupied a cramped workshop cluttered with parchment, ink bottles, measuring cords, and enough rolled maps to bury a horse. Not that anyone would want to bury a horse under maps. That would raise many practical questions. The mapmaker himself looked nearly as ancient as some of his charts. His beard resembled tangled fishing nets. His eyebrows appeared to have declared independence years earlier, and his hands trembled slightly as he worked. Aldrich spent hours examining the man's collection. Most maps showed familiar kingdoms and trade routes. Others depicted distant regions only partially explored. But one map caught his attention immediately. It hung alone on a wall, faded, water-stained, covered with notes written by many different hands. Most curious of all, the map simply stopped, not at the edge of parchment, at the edge of the drawn world. Beyond a jagged coastline, nothing existed except empty space. Aldrich stepped closer. "What lies there?" he asked. The old mapmaker glanced up. For several moments he said nothing. Then he sighed. "The question every fool asks," Aldrich smiled. "I've been called worse. I imagine often, fairly often." The old man nodded as though this confirmed several suspicions. Then he rose slowly and approached the map. His finger touched the unfinished coastline. Nobody knows. Surely someone must. Many claim they do. The mapmaker's eyes narrowed. That is not the same thing. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, shadows stretched across shelves crowded with charts from distant lands. The old man continued speaking. Generations ago, explorers sailed west beyond known waters. And most returned. Aldrich frowned. Most? The mapmaker nodded. Those who returned told different stories. Some described endless fog. Others spoke of towering cliffs. One claimed the sea poured into darkness like water from a bucket. That particular sailor was either very imaginative or very drunk. Possibly both. Historians still debate the matter. Aldrich listened carefully. What did they all agree on? The old man hesitated. Then he answered, that something exists beyond the last known coast. A silence followed, the kind of silence that quietly plants dangerous ideas. Aldrich stared again at the unfinished map. He felt that familiar sensation, the one that always arrived before his greatest journeys. Curiosity, sharp, persistent, impossible to ignore. The mapmaker seemed to recognize it immediately. Oh no, Aldrich blinked. Oh no, I know that expression. What expression? The expression of a man about to make his life considerably more difficult. Aldrich laughed. The old man did not. That was generally not encouraging. Still, Aldrich's decision had already begun forming, like a seed taking root, like a tide gathering strength, like an unfortunate idea refusing to leave. Over the next several days, he searched for information. He visited sailors, merchants, pilgrims, fishermen, anyone who might know something. Most offered contradictory advice. A few offered nonsense. One elderly fisherman insisted. Giant fish carried entire castles on their backs. To be fair, medieval people believed many remarkable things. There was once a genuine belief in certain regions that barnacle geese grew from driftwood. Humanity has always possessed a wonderful ability to look at something confusing and confidently invent a much stranger explanation. Yet amid the rumors and exaggerations, patterns slowly emerged. Mentions of a distant western route, references to ancient markers. Stories passed from generation to generation. Fragments, pieces, clues, enough to suggest there might actually be a path. And if there was a path, Aldrich intended to follow it. By the first frost of winter, his preparations were complete. His pack contained food, spare clothing, writing supplies, rope, tools, and several maps. He also carried a journal, because if he truly reached the edge of the world, he suspected people might eventually ask for details. And if he failed, well, at least future travelers would know precisely which mistakes not to repeat, assuming they could read his handwriting. That was never guaranteed. On the morning of departure, cold sunlight spilled across the harbor. Ships rocked gently in their moorings. Seabirds wheeled overhead. The world appeared entirely ordinary, which somehow made his destination feel even more extraordinary. Aldrich stood facing the western horizon. Beyond it lay uncertainty, mystery, possibly disaster, possibly wonder, most likely both. He took a slow breath, adjusted his pack, and began walking toward the unknown. The road ahead stretched beyond sight. For the first time in years, he had no idea where it truly ended, and that was exactly why he intended to follow it. Aldrich left the familiar roads behind on a morning so cold the grass seemed dusted with powdered glass. At first, nothing felt heroic. That is worth remembering. Great journeys rarely begin with thunder, prophecy, or dramatic music. Usually they begin with sore feet, bad weather, and the sudden realization that packed bread becomes hard enough to threaten dental work after only 2 days. The western road carried him through fields, gone pale with frost, past sleeping orchards and mills, whose wheels turned slowly in winter streams. Villages appeared and vanished behind him, each one smaller than the last. At every inn, stable, and roadside shrine, someone told him to turn back. Aldrich thanked them politely. Then he continued. This was one of his more irritating gifts. He could accept advice with great courtesy while ignoring every useful part of it. For a week he followed trade roads marked by wagon ruts and milestone crosses. Merchants passed him with carts full of wool, salt, iron tools, and barrels that smelled suspiciously like fish no longer committed to freshness. Pilgrims shared campfires with him. A monk with ink-stained fingers showed him a route through marsh country, then warned him that no decent Christian road continued much farther west. Aldrich asked what lay beyond. The monk tucked his hands into his sleeves. Empty country, he said. Empty of people, empty of certainty. That was not especially helpful. It was, however, very memorable. By the 10th day, even the milestones began to look neglected. The carved letters softened beneath moss. Shrines leaned at odd angles. Bridges became narrower, older, and less confident about their purpose. The road itself thinned from packed earth into a stony track, wandering between low hills. Aldrich copied each change into his journal. He noted the shape of rivers, the tilt of ridges, the distance between villages. He marked where old roads split and where new ones simply gave up. His notes were careful, though his handwriting still looked as if a spider had fallen into ink and panicked across the page. One evening, he reached the last true market town before the western wastes. It sat in a hollow beneath bare-branched trees, its walls patched with timber and stone from older ruins. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Dogs barked from alleyways. Bells rang for dusk, slow and tired. Here, Aldrich searched for guides. Most refused immediately. One man laughed so hard he spilled his ale. Another asked whether Aldrich had offended a duke and chosen exile by geography. A third listened quietly, studied Aldrich's face, and said, "You have that look." Aldrich sighed. "I have been told." The man was named Bren, a muleteer with scarred knuckles and a nose that had clearly lost arguments in the past. He knew the tracks through the uplands, where old royal roads vanished into sheep paths and border stones stood in places no king currently claimed. "I can take you 5 days west," Bren said. "After that, you are on your own." "Why only 5? "Because after 5 days, the land stops caring whether men return." Aldrich considered this. That sounds poetic. It is practical. They left the next morning with one shaggy mule named Porridge. The name suited him. Porridge was pale, lumpy, slow, and impossible to hurry without serious emotional negotiation. Still, he carried supplies well enough, and Bren insisted no wiser animal existed in 3 counties. After 2 days with the mule, Aldrich suspected wisdom and stubbornness were related. The uplands rose gradually. Fields gave way to grazing country, then to heather, stones, and wind-bent trees. The air sharpened. Streams ran clear over slate beds. Ravens followed them at a distance, croaking as though offering commentary. Bren rarely spoke unless necessary. When he did, it was usually to point out practical dangers. Bog there. Loose shale. Do not drink from that pool. Never sleep under a dead tree unless you enjoy being flattened with no warning. Useful wisdom, all of it, Not cheerful, exactly, but useful. At night they camped beside low fires, and Aldrich asked about the lands ahead. Bren answered in fragments. Once, these roads had connected border forts. Before that, shepherd tribes had marked the ridges with standing stones. Before that, according to local tales, giants crossed the valleys carrying baskets of hills. This explained, in Bren's opinion, why the landscape looked carelessly arranged. Aldrich wrote that down too, not because he believed in hill basket giants, necessarily, but because strange beliefs often pointed toward older memories. People embroidered truth with wonders when plain facts became too dull to survive. There was an eccentric custom in those uplands. Travelers left bent nails at certain crossroads to confuse evil spirits. The spirits, people said, were compelled to straighten each nail before following. Aldrich saw hundreds of them driven into old posts, rusted and crooked, like tiny iron warnings. Bren left one himself. Aldrich raised an eyebrow. You believe that? Bren shrugged. I believe nails are cheap. Fair enough. On the fifth day, they reached a ridge where the track descended toward a vast, empty stretch of moorland. The world ahead looked unfinished. No village smoke, no church tower, no pasture walls, only rolling brown earth, pools of black water, and distant hills blurred by mist. The western sky hung low in silver. It seemed less like a direction and more like a question. Bren stopped. This is where I turn. Aldrich looked down into the open land. That is the way. That is a way. Comforting distinction. Better than a false promise. They unloaded Aldrich's supplies from porridge. Bren checked his straps, tightened his cloak, and handed him a small packet wrapped in cloth. Dried apples, he said, for when your food becomes depressing. Aldrich accepted it with genuine gratitude. Thank you. Bren nodded toward the moor. Follow the old marker stones when you find them. Do not trust lights after sunset. Do not walk into mist if you can wait for it to pass. And if you hear bells where there is no village, go the other direction. Aldrich paused. Is that folklore or experience? Yes. Again, not helpful. Again, memorable. Bren climbed onto Porridge, who looked delighted to be going anywhere except forward. Before leaving, the muleteer studied Aldrich one last time. You are not the first to go looking for the world's edge. I know. You may be the first fool organized enough to find it. Aldrich smiled. I will take that as encouragement. You would. Then Bren turned east, and the soft clop of Porridge's hooves faded behind him. Aldrich stood alone on the ridge. The known world lay at his back. Roads, inns, bells, markets, arguments about ale prices, and all the comfortable noise of human certainty. Ahead stretched a country where maps grew pale and unreliable. He opened his journal and drew a line beneath the last marked road. Then he wrote, "From here, the old world loosens." After that, he tucked the journal away, stepped down from the ridge, and entered the empty west. By midday, Aldrich found the first boundary stone. It leaned from the earth like an old tooth, gray and weather-worn, half swallowed by heather. At first he nearly passed it, mistaking it for one more boulder among thousands. Then he noticed the carving, a spiral, a line, 3 small dots arranged like stars. He crouched beside it and brushed away lichen with his thumb. The marks were shallow but deliberate, not decoration, not random scratches. Someone had placed this stone here with purpose, then trusted it to outlast roads, kingdoms, and whatever confident fool first said, "I know a shortcut." Aldrich copied the symbols into his journal. The moor stretched around him, silent except for wind, combing through dry grass. No birds called, No cartwheels creaked. No voices carried over the hills. The emptiness was so complete, it felt almost crowded, as if unseen memories lingered just beyond the edge of hearing. He walked west by the line of stones. Some stood upright, some had fallen, some were buried so deeply that only their tops showed above the turf. Each bore variations of the same markings: spirals, dots, crossed lines, crescent shapes, and tiny notches that might have counted distance or danger. Aldrich measured the spaces between them as best he could. They were irregular, but not careless. A forgotten road, perhaps, or a warning. Possibly both. The best warnings usually become roads, because people are marvelous at seeing a sign that says danger and thinking, excellent, someone has already found the interesting part. Near sunset, he discovered a second kind of marker. It was taller than the others, and blackened by age, as though fire had once kissed its surface. Around its base lay small offerings: cracked shells, bent pins, a strip of faded cloth, and the bone of some bird picked clean by weather. Aldrich did not touch them. He was curious. Not completely ridiculous. Well, not always. The tall stone bore words carved in an older script. He recognized only fragments, but enough to understand the warning. Beyond this line, names are easily lost. That was cheerful. Exactly the sort of sentence one enjoys finding while alone in a trackless moor, with evening falling and supper consisting mainly of hard cheese and regret. Aldrich made camp in the lee of a low rise. He kept his fire small, both to save fuel and because the open land seemed to dislike bright things. As darkness gathered, the stones around him became pale shapes in the gloom, each one watching in its patient stone-like way. He ate bread, cheese, and one of Bren's dried apples. The apple was tough, sour, and absolutely wonderful. This is an important truth of travel. Hunger improves almost every meal. A starving man will praise burnt porridge like a royal feast, though he may later reconsider in more comfortable circumstances. Before sleeping, Aldrich read back through his notes. He saw how the symbols changed from stone to stone. The spiral widened. The dots shifted position. The carved line, once straight, began to bend westward. A map hidden in markers. Not a map, drawn for comfort beside a hearth, but one built into the land itself. He slept lightly. Near midnight, he woke to a sound. Not footsteps, not wind, a tapping. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. Aldrich lay still beneath his cloak. The fire had sunk to embers. The moor lay under moonlight, silver and cold. Far off, one of the stones stood darker than the rest. Tap, tap, tap. He reached slowly for his knife. The sound stopped. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then, from somewhere beyond the rise, came a faint scraping, like stone dragged over stone. Aldrich did not investigate. This may seem surprising, given his personality, but even curiosity has its evening hours. Sometimes bravery is simply staying under the blanket and pretending not to have heard something that absolutely heard you. At dawn, he found the cause, or at least something pretending to be the cause. One of the fallen stones had shifted during the night. Its buried underside now showed fresh carvings, small human figures walking toward a jagged line. Above them, a crescent moon. Beneath them, wavy marks like water. Aldrich stared for a long time. No person could have moved the stone quietly, not alone, not in the dark, not without leaving tracks in the damp soil. And yet there it was. He sketched the figures carefully. Beside the stone lay a small object he had not noticed the night before. A bronze token. green with age, pierced through the center. On one face was stamped a ship. On the other, an eye. He picked it up. A poor decision, perhaps, but a fascinating one. The token was cold enough to sting his fingers. He wrapped it in cloth and tucked it away. All through that day, the markers grew stranger. Some stones were carved with hands pointing west. Others showed fish with bird wings, men with blank faces, boats balanced on waves shaped like teeth. On one stone, someone had carved a row of travelers. Their heads had been deliberately scratched away. Aldrich found that more unsettling than any monster. Names lost, faces erased. Warnings did not always need blood and thunder. Sometimes they only needed absence. By afternoon, he reached a shallow valley where dozens of boundary stones stood in broken rows. The place looked like an abandoned gathering. Some stones leaned together like tired old men. Others lay flat, covered by moss. A few remained upright in a circle around a central slab. Aldrich approached carefully. The central slab bore many inscriptions, layered over one another by different hands across generations. Some were formal, some desperate, some scratched hastily, as if the carver had little time. He read what he could. We passed west, under red dawn. Mareth saw lights and followed. Do not answer when called by your own voice. The sea is nearer than it should be. Return, while return is simple. Aldrich swallowed. That last line stayed with him. Return while return is simple. It was not command or threat. It sounded like advice given by someone kind. That made it worse. In a crack beneath the slab, he found scraps of parchment sealed in waxed leather. Most had rotted, but one fragment remained legible. It described a group of pilgrims, scholars, and sailors who had crossed the valley 80 years before, seeking the margin of creation. They had believed the boundary stones marked an ancient route to the last coast. Only one name remained clear. Edrin Vale. Aldrich recognized it. Edrin Vale had written a famous book on tides, though most scholars considered the final chapters nonsense. Those chapters spoke of western waters, where the moon pulled sideways and compasses spun like startled beetles. Apparently, Edrin had not invented everything. That was either thrilling or deeply inconvenient. Aldrich copied the fragment, then returned it to its hiding place. Some things belong to the road, not to any one traveler. As evening settled over the valley, he noticed one final carving on the central slab. A spiral, a bent line, 3 dots, and beneath them, newly scratched compared with the rest, a phrase in plain speech: the edge remembers every footstep. Aldrich stood very still. The wind moved through the stones with a low, hollow sound, almost like distant breathing. He looked west. The valley opened into darker moorland where the marker stones continued, smaller and harder to see. He could still turn back. The thought came clearly, without shame. Back to Bren's Ridge, back to market towns, inns, ordinary roads, and people who laughed too loudly at impossible questions. Instead, Aldrich tightened his cloak, touched the bronze token through the cloth, and stepped beyond the circle of stones. Behind him, the valley of forgotten markers faded into mist. Ahead, the old path continued, and somewhere beyond it, the world waited to end. The moorlands did not welcome Aldrich. They did not attack him either. That would have been almost polite. Instead, they simply stretched on in every direction. Mile after mile, offering nothing but wet ground, low clouds, bitter wind, and the occasional patch of grass that looked solid until his boots sank halfway to the ankle. By the second morning beyond the Valley of Markers, his cloak was damp, his fingers ached, and his patience had become a delicate little candle, in a very rude storm. Still, the stones continued west. Some were no taller than his knee now. Others were hidden among reeds or half buried under peat. He had to search for them carefully, stopping often to scrape moss away from gray surfaces and compare symbols with his notes. The spiral, the bent line, the 3 dots, always west. The land rolled gently, but every rise revealed only another rise behind it. Pools of black water reflected the sky so perfectly they looked like holes cut into the earth. Once Aldrich nearly stepped into one while admiring a raven overhead, which was a fine reminder that poetry and survival should take turns. At noon, rain began. Not dramatic rain, not cleansing rain, just a miserable, steady drizzle that seemed personally offended by dry clothing. Aldrich pulled his hood lower and walked on. He thought often of Bren's warning. Do not trust lights after sunset. Do not walk into mist. If you hear bells where there is no village, go the other direction. Simple rules, which was helpful because the moor did not offer many simple things. By late afternoon, mist gathered in the hollows. It came crawling rather than drifting, pale and low, sliding over the ground like spilled milk with sinister ambitions. Aldrich climbed a ridge to avoid it and made camp among stones, sharp enough to discourage sleep. His supper was oatcake, hard cheese, and water that tasted faintly of moss. A feast for kings, assuming the kingdom had recently collapsed. As darkness fell, he saw a light. It flickered far to the south, warm and golden. For one foolish heartbeat, he thought of hearths, shelter, and stew. Then he remembered Bren. No village smoke had marked the horizon. No path turned that way. No sound carried except the wind. The light bobbed gently as though someone walked with a lantern. Aldrich watched it from beneath his hood. It paused. Then it moved closer. He did not call out. He did not wave. He fed no more fuel to the fire and let the embers dim. The light remained for a long while, patient as a fisherman. Then, near midnight, it vanished. In the morning, Aldrich found no tracks to the south, only bog pools and reeds. He wrote in his journal, first false light seen, pretty, unhelpful, avoid. This was perhaps not the most scholarly phrasing, but accuracy matters. The next days tested him in smaller, meaner ways. His boots rubbed blisters into both heels. His food grew monotonous. His shoulders stiffened beneath the weight of his pack. Twice, he lost sight of the marker stones and had to circle for hours before finding them again. Once, a sudden gust tore a page from his journal and sent him chasing it across the moor like a man pursuing an exceptionally rude bird. He recovered it from a thorn bush. The page survived. His dignity did not. On the 6th day, he met another living person. At least, Aldrich assumed she was living, though out there one learned not to be too confident. She stood beside a peat-cutting trench, wrapped in a patched brown cloak with a bundle of reeds tied across her back. Her hair was gray, her face narrow, and her eyes bright as whetstones. Aldrich greeted her gently. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You are going the wrong way. I am going west." Yes. That seemed to settle the matter in her mind. She introduced herself as Gisela and claimed to live in a hut 2 valleys north, though Aldrich saw no sign of smoke in that direction. She knew the moor well and spoke of it as one might speak of a difficult old relative. Dangerous, stubborn, and not entirely without charm. When Aldrich asked about the boundary stones, Gisela spat into the grass. "Old road," she said. "To where?" "To what waits after roads." Aldrich decided not to press too quickly. Instead, he shared dried apple. This improved relations considerably. Gisela told him an odd local curiosity. In the deep moor, people once placed silver coins under the tongues of dead sheep. Not for burial, not exactly, but to keep wandering spirits busy counting livestock instead of troubling households. Aldrich asked whether it worked. Gisela shrugged. Fewer complaints from the sheep. Hard to argue with that. She warned him that the western moor changed distances. A hill seen at dawn might take all day to reach. A pool behind you might appear ahead. Voices could carry from years rather than miles. Aldrich smiled politely until she grabbed his wrist. Listen, when the moor speaks in a voice you love, answer with silence. That ended his smile. Before leaving, Gisela gave him a strip of blue thread. Tie it around your wrist, she said, for remembering. Remembering what? Yourself. Then she walked north into the mist and disappeared between two ridges. Aldrich tied the thread around his wrist. He felt silly doing it. He kept it there anyway. That evening, the first voice came. He was crossing a long stretch of pale grass when he heard someone call his name. Aldrich, soft, familiar, behind him. He stopped. Every part of him wanted to turn. The voice belonged to his younger brother, Corin, who had died years before of fever after a spring flood. Aldrich remembered his laugh, his quick hands, his terrible singing, especially the singing. The boy could make a hymn sound like a goose trapped in a bucket. Aldrich, the voice called again. His throat tightened. The blue thread pressed lightly around his wrist. He stared forward. He did not answer. The moor grew silent. Then the voice changed. It became Bren. Then the old mapmaker. Then his own voice, calling from somewhere just beyond the mist. Aldrich walked on. Not quickly. Quickness felt too much like fear. He walked steadily, counting steps beneath his breath until the voices faded behind him. At last, near twilight, the land rose onto firmer ground. The marker stones reappeared, larger now, black against the western sky. Beyond them, the moor sloped toward a distant darkness that might have been forest, cloud, or sea. Aldrich removed his pack and sat beside the nearest stone. For a while, he did nothing. His hands shook slightly. That annoyed him. Then he laughed, quietly and without much humor. So, he said to the empty land, that was unpleasant. The wind offered no apology. Still he had passed through. The endless moor had taken warmth, certainty, comfort, and several layers of skin from his heels. It had offered false lights, false voices, and rain with the enthusiasm of a tax collector. But it had not turned him back. Aldrich opened his journal and wrote by the last gray light. Of day the road continues. I continue with it. Then he slept beneath the watching stones, while the mist curled below the ridge and whispered to itself until morning. By morning, the moor had changed its mind about being endless. The ground began to dip westward, slowly at first, then with greater purpose, as though the whole land were bowing toward something hidden beyond the horizon. The heather thinned. The peat pools vanished. Stone replaced mud beneath Aldrich's boots, which was a kindness he did not fully trust. Travel teaches a person gratitude. It also teaches suspicion. When a road suddenly improves after trying to drown you for days, you do not applaud. You look around and wonder what it wants. The marker stones led him down through a valley of pale grass, where wind moved in long silver waves. By noon, he smelled salt. He stopped at once. The sea, not visible yet, but present in the air, sharp and cold, mixed with the scent of kelp and distant storms. Aldrich stood very still, breathing it in. After so many days of wet earth and more grass, the smell seemed almost impossible. He laughed softly. Then he checked his map, which was useless. Then he laughed again, because sometimes uselessness deserves recognition. By late afternoon, he reached a ridge and saw the village. It clung to a slope above a wide gray bay, its cottages built from stone. So dark they looked pulled from the cliffs themselves. Smoke rose from low chimneys and flattened immediately in the sea wind. Nets hung from poles. Narrow boats rested above the tide line. Beyond the bay, the western ocean stretched beneath a sky the color of pewter. The village faced the horizon as if watching for someone who had promised to return long ago and failed to do so. Aldrich descended carefully. No wall guarded the place. No gate marked its entrance. Only a row of weathered posts stood beside the track, each tied with strips of cloth, shells, and tiny carved wooden birds. Some birds had no eyes. Some had too many. Aldrich decided not to judge local art during first contact. A dog barked when he entered, then another, then several more, because dogs have always believed that one announcement is never enough. Faces appeared in doorways. A woman carrying a basket of fish stopped mid-step. Two children vanished behind a cart. An old man mending a net looked up with the exhausted expression of someone who had seen travelers before and rarely found them profitable. Aldrich raised one hand. "I mean no harm," the old man squinted. People who mean harm rarely begin with better speeches. "That is fair. What do you want?" "Shelter for the night, food if it can be spared. Knowledge, if anyone is willing." The old man's eyes moved to Aldrich's pack, his worn boots, the blue thread still tied around his wrist. Then the man looked toward the west. "Ah," he said. It was not a welcoming sound. It was the sound people make when they discover a roof leak directly above their bed. The old man introduced himself as Tavern, headman of the village of Salomir. He led Aldrich to a cottage near the shore, where a hearth burned low and the room smelled of smoke, fish stew, and drying wool. Aldrich paid with 2 silver coins and a small brass clasp from the eastern markets. Torvin accepted the coins immediately and studied the clasp with mild suspicion, as though it might begin singing. Soon Aldrich sat beside the hearth with a wooden bowl of stew, warming his hands. The stew was thick, salty, and full of things he chose not to identify too closely. It was wonderful. A person who has crossed moorland on oatcakes can become emotional about soup. Torvin's wife, Mara, watched him eat. "You came by the stone road," she said. "Yes." "Then you ignored many warnings." "Several." "Were they unclear?" "No," she nodded. "At least you are honest." Around the hearth, villagers gathered quietly. Not too many at first, just enough to pretend they were not gathering. A young fisherman leaned in the doorway. A girl with wind-tangled hair sat on a stool. An elderly woman brought mending but did not sew a single stitch. Aldrich explained his search carefully. He did not declare that he sought the edge of the world with grand certainty. He had learned that saying impossible things too loudly made people less helpful. Instead, he asked about the western waters, old routes, vanished coastlines, and travelers who had passed through before him. At first, nobody answered. The fire cracked. Outside, waves dragged stones across the beach with a sound like slow breathing. At last, the elderly woman spoke. "My mother saw the sky split." Everyone looked at her. Torvin sighed. "Old Mara." "What?" she said. "I did." Aldrich turned toward her. "Where?" "Out beyond the last shoals. West, under winter stars. The horizon opened like a seam, blue fire behind it. Then it closed." The young fisherman muttered, "Or lightning." Old Mara pointed a needle at him. "Lightning does not make the gulls fall silent for 3 days, clever boy." That ended the debate. Mara told him that Salomir had always watched the horizon. Ships sometimes appeared where no ships should be. Bells rang under fog. Once every few years, the tide withdrew far beyond the reef and revealed a line of stones leading out beneath the water. No one followed them anymore. "Any more?" Aldrich asked. Torvin gave Mara a warning glance. She ignored him completely, as elderly women in stories often do, because age grants a certain royal immunity to caution. "There was a crew," she said, "long before you. They came asking about the far boundary, scholars, sailors, a priest who wrote everything down. Their leader had a narrow face and a silver ring shaped like an eye." Aldrich felt the bronze token in his pouch. "Edrin Vale?" Mara's gaze sharpened. "You know the name." "I found it on the moor." The room grew colder, though the fire had not changed. Torvin leaned forward. "Vale sailed west from here. One boat returned empty." "Empty?" "No crew, no blood, no sail torn, just empty. The oars were neatly tied. The priest's book lay open on the bench." "What did it say?" Torvin's mouth tightened. "Only one line." The room became very still. Mara answered instead. "The sea has a memory, deeper than ours." Aldrich wrote it down later, but in that moment, he simply listened. Salomir held many such fragments. A child born during a red tide who spoke only in whispers until age 7. A fisherman who claimed he saw stars reflected in the sea at noon. A tradition of turning mirrors to the wall during heavy fog because old people believed reflections invited things to look back. That was the village's eccentric curiosity. And Aldrich privately decided that if something in a mirror looked back at him from the wrong side of the world, he would also become quite traditional very quickly. After supper, Torvin led him outside. The night was clear. The bay lay dark below. Far beyond the reef, the horizon rested beneath a wide field of stars. It looked ordinary at first, beautiful even, peaceful in the way. Dangerous things can appear peaceful from a distance. Torvin pointed west. "There is a lighthouse 3 days along the cliffs. No harbor near it. No village. Only the keeper." "Why build a lighthouse where ships cannot land?" "Because something out there needs warning from the shore." "Ships?" Torvin did not answer immediately. A cold wind moved between them. Then he said, "Not only ships." Aldrich studied the darkness. Far away, so faint he almost missed it, a small light blinked once on the coast. Then again. Then vanished. Torvin watched his face. "You will go?" "Yes." "Of course." The headman sounded tired, not surprised. Behind them, the village windows glowed softly. Families settled near their hearths. Nets dried in the wind. Children slept while the sea worked its old music against the stones. Aldrich wondered what it would be like to live here, always facing the horizon, always knowing the world might be stranger than comfort allowed. He slept that night in Torvin's loft, beneath blankets smelling of wool and smoke. Before dawn, he woke to the sound of bells, not from the village, not from any church. They rang faintly across the water, slow and silver, where only darkness waited. Aldrich lay still and remembered Bren's rule. If you hear bells where there is no village, go the other direction. Unfortunately, the next stage of his journey led exactly toward them. Aldrich left Salomir beneath a sky pale with dawn and full of gulls that seemed offended by the day. Torvin walked with him as far as the cloth-tied posts at the edge of the village. Mara had packed him smoked fish, barley cakes, and a small jar of something dark and sour that she called sea plum preserve. Aldrich tasted a little on his thumb and decided it was either a delicacy or a punishment from the coast itself. Possibly both. Old Mara pressed a shell into his palm before he departed. It was smooth, white, and oddly heavy. "For listening," she said. "To what?" She smiled without showing teeth. "You will know when not to." That was the sort of gift Aldrich had learned to accept without asking too many practical questions. The track west of Salomir climbed quickly from the bay. Soon the village dropped behind him, its smoke fading into the morning haze, while the sea widened beside the cliffs. The path was narrow, stitched between rock and wind. On one side rose rough slopes speckled with thorn and coarse grass. On the other, the land fell sharply to waves breaking white against black stone. Aldrich tried not to walk too close to the edge. The edge, he felt, already had enough of his attention. For most of the day, the path followed the coastline through lonely country. No carts had worn it smooth. No pilgrims had polished the stones with faithful feet. It was a keeper's path, perhaps, or a smuggler's route, or the kind of trail made by goats and later blamed on men. By noon, rain swept in from the sea. It came sideways, naturally. Rain on the coast rarely falls down like civilized weather. It arrives with ambition, aiming for ears, sleeves, boots, and any part of a person still pretending to be dry. Aldrich lowered his hood and continued. The sea below behaved strangely. Waves moved in crossing patterns, colliding and folding over one another, as if two tides argued in different languages. Patches of water gleamed silver under cloud, while other patches remained dark as ink. Once, he saw a line of foam racing against the wind. He wrote that down when the rain eased. He also wrote, "Coastline unstable in appearance. Path safe enough. Mood poor." By late afternoon, he saw the lighthouse. It stood on a headland far ahead, tall and narrow, built from pale stone that caught the gray light and held it. No harbor lay beneath it. No village clustered nearby. No road led inland from its door. It rose alone above cliffs hammered by sea spray, as if placed there by someone who wanted to warn the world but had no interest in visitors. A small flame burned behind glass at its crown, though sunset was still an hour away. Aldrich reached the headland with aching legs and a stomach that had begun negotiating loudly with the barley cakes. The lighthouse door was iron-bound oak, marked with carvings of waves, stars, and open eyes. A rope bell hung beside it. Aldrich pulled once. The bell made no sound. He frowned and pulled again. Still nothing. Then a voice behind him said, "It rings inward." Aldrich turned quickly. A woman stood on the path he had just climbed. She was perhaps 60, perhaps older, with bronze-brown skin lined deeply by wind and silver hair braided close to her head. She carried a lantern in one hand, unlit, and wore a dark coat patched with seal leather. Her eyes were calm, which somehow made them more unsettling. "I did not hear you approach," Aldrich said. "No," she replied. That was all. After a moment, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Aldrich followed into a round chamber smelling of oil, salt, stone, and old smoke. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ropes, lamps, tools, jars of wicks, and bundles of dried herbs. A narrow stair spiraled upward into shadow. The woman bolted the door behind them. "I am Keeper Elian," she said. "You came from Salomir." "Yes." "They still tell travelers to come here?" "Not exactly." "Good. I would hate to think they had become foolish." Aldrich glanced around. "Yet you expected me." Elian set her lantern on a table. "The western road always sends a few. Not many. Enough. She gave him stew from an iron pot, and he ate beside a small hearth while she checked the lamps. The stew contained lentils, onions, and some kind of smoked meat. After days of fish and road food, it tasted like kindness wearing a practical apron. Aldrich asked why the lighthouse stood where no ships could land. Elian trimmed a wick before answering. Because ships are not the only things that lose their way. What else does? She looked toward the shuttered window. Light, sound, memory, sometimes men. That seemed comprehensive. The lighthouse, she explained, had been tended by her family for 9 generations, not by royal order, nor by merchant charter, nor by monastery duty. The first keeper had been a sailor who returned from the far west without his crew, his tongue, or the ability to sleep indoors. He built the tower with stones dragged from a ruined abbey and lit a flame each night until he died, sitting upright beside it. Cheerful ancestor, Aldrich murmured. Elian almost smiled. We honor him from a distance. The tower's purpose was not merely to guide ships away from rocks. Its flame marked a boundary, a fixed point for those who had ventured too near the western confusion and still wished to return. Without it, Elian said, travelers might sail in circles for weeks, or come ashore in places no sane map would admit existed. Aldrich told her about Edrin Vale. Elian nodded once. He stayed here. You knew of him? His name is carved upstairs. She led Aldrich up the spiral stair. The steps narrowed as they climbed, curling around the tower's hollow center. Wind hummed through cracks in the stone. At the top was the lantern room, its glass thick and greenish, its great lamp burning with a steady blue-white flame. Around the walls, hundreds of names had been scratched into the stone, some neat, some frantic, some half-finished. Aldrich found Edrin Vale near a window facing west. Beside the name was the same symbol from the bronze token, an eye over a ship. Below it, a line had been carved carefully. The coast is not where it was yesterday. Aldrich felt a quiet thrill of recognition. The vanished coastline, the next clue. Elian noticed his expression. That is why you came. Yes. She reached into a wooden chest and withdrew a roll of oilskin. Inside lay a chart, old but carefully preserved. It showed the headland, surrounding reefs, and a dotted path extending westward along a coastline that no longer appeared from the tower windows. Once, Elian said, there was land there. Aldrich studied the chart. Was it swallowed by the sea? Sometimes. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one. According to keeper lore, the missing coast revealed itself during particular tides, fogs, and moon phases. Not fully. Never reliably. A traveler on foot might find shelves of stone where open water should be, coves that vanished by dawn, and beaches that appeared only under starlight. There was also an eccentric rule among the keepers: never whistle in the lantern room. The first keeper believed whistling taught the wind your name, and the wind, being a notorious gossip, would pass it to things best left uninformed. Aldrich did not whistle. He had many flaws, but unnecessary wind gossip was not among them. Elian allowed him to copy the chart, but not keep it. She watched as he traced the dotted coastline by lamplight, marking tides, hazards, and 3 points labeled with simple warnings. Do not sleep here. Do not drink here. Do not look back here. Aldrich tapped the last warning. Why not? Elian folded her hands. Because some sights follow better when noticed. He decided he disliked practical answers, even more than vague ones. That night, he slept in a small chamber beneath the lantern room. The tower creaked around him. Waves struck the cliffs far below. Above, the lamp turned slowly, casting thin bands of light through cracks in the shutters. Near midnight, Aldrich woke. From somewhere beyond the window came a faint bell, slow, silver, far out at sea. Then another sound joined it, a voice, low and patient, speaking a language he did not know. Aldrich reached for old Mara's shell. He held it to his ear. Inside, he heard nothing. Not the sea, not the bell, not the voice. Only deep, perfect silence. So he listened to that instead until the strange sounds faded and sleep returned like a soft cloak over his shoulders. At dawn, Elian opened the western door of the lighthouse, a door Aldrich had not noticed before. Beyond it, stone steps descended the cliff toward a shelf of rock hidden by mist. "The tide will turn soon," she said. "Follow the old coast while it permits you." Aldrich tightened his pack. "How long will it permit me?" Elian looked west, where fog moved over waters that seemed almost too still. "Long enough, if you do not argue with it." Aldrich stepped onto the stairs. Behind him, the lighthouse flame burned steady in the morning gloom, a patient eye watching the Edgewood Road. The steps below the lighthouse were slick with salt and greenweed, which made every movement feel less like walking and more like negotiating with gravity. Aldrich descended carefully. Above him, Keeper Elian remained at the western door, one hand resting against the stone frame. The lighthouse flame still turned behind its glass, pale even in daylight. For a moment, it seemed less like a tower and more like an eye left open for the benefit of fools. Aldrich was beginning to understand how often he qualified. At the foot of the cliff, the steps ended on a flat shelf of black rock. Mist lay thick across the water. Waves moved quietly, almost politely, as though trying not to interrupt something older than weather. He unfolded his copied chart. According to Elian's markings, the vanished coast began just beyond the first reef, where no visible land presently existed. That was inconvenient. Aldrich looked at the water, then at the chart, then back at the water. "Lovely," he said. "A road with trust issues." He waited. Elian had told him the tide would turn soon, and for once he decided not to challenge the wisdom of a lighthouse keeper whose family had spent 9 generations staring at alarming water. The change began slowly. The sea drew back from the rocks with a long sigh. Foam slid away, pools emptied into cracks. Then, beyond the reef, dark shapes emerged beneath the mist. Not islands, not exactly. Long ribs of stone rose from the withdrawing tide, forming a broken path westward. Some were broad enough to walk comfortably. Others were narrow, jagged, and wet. Between them, channels of water still rushed and swirled. Aldrich checked the chart again. There it was, the old coast, or what remained of it. He stepped forward. The first stones were firm beneath his boots. Limpets clung to their sides. Bladder wrack gleamed like dark leather. Tiny crabs retreated from his shadow with the offended haste of little armored nobles. The air smelled of salt, kelp, and minerals newly exposed after long drowning. Behind him, the lighthouse stood on the cliff, visible through thinning mist. Ahead, the stone path curved along a shoreline that should not have existed. It ran parallel to the visible coast for a while, then drifted farther west, toward open water. Aldrich followed. By mid-morning, the cliff behind him had faded. The world narrowed to rock, mist, and sea. Stranger still, the vanished coast did not look ruined by waves alone. He passed square-cut stones buried among natural reefs. Steps led down into pools where no house stood above them. A carved lintel lay half-submerged, decorated with fish, moons, and a row of tiny human ears. That last detail gave him pause. He copied it into his journal with reluctance. A curious practice had once existed along forgotten coasts. People carved ears above doorways to invite good news and keep away gossip. It had apparently failed here, unless the good news was, the sea has arrived, in which case the neighborhood had been thoroughly informed. Near noon, he reached the first warning on Elian's chart. Do not sleep here. The place was a hollow between two stone ridges, dry enough to rest in and sheltered from the wind. Smooth sand covered the ground. A ring of pale shells marked the center. It looked inviting, suspiciously inviting. Aldrich's legs ached, his shoulders burned. The hollow seemed to whisper of warmth, stillness, and just a few harmless minutes with his eyes closed. He stood at its edge. Then he noticed bones, not many, small ones, mostly, gulls, fish, perhaps a fox. They lay half-buried around the shell ring, arranged with odd neatness. Each skull pointed inward. Aldrich backed away. Not sleeping, he murmured. Excellent suggestion. He ate standing up some distance farther on, which is not the noblest way to dine, but nobility is overrated when the ground may be plodding. The path grew more broken after that. Twice he had to jump narrow channels. Once he waded knee-deep through water so cold it seemed to bite with teeth. The mist thinned now and then, revealing glimpses of impossible shoreline, cliffs where open sea had been minutes before, arches of stone fading as he watched, beaches that appeared beneath one wave and vanished beneath the next. He began marking time not by the sun, which remained hidden, but by the rhythm of the tide. Elian had warned him. When the water begins to return, leave the old coast immediately. Unfortunately, the old coast had no interest in making that simple. By afternoon, Aldrich found a road, a real one. Flat stones laid in careful courses ran across a stretch of wet sand, disappearing into mist ahead. Wheel ruts marked the surface. On either side stood the stumps of posts that might once have supported lamps. Aldrich knelt and touched the stones. They were not ancient, in the way ruins usually were. No grass grew between them. No barnacles covered their tops. They looked as though a cart might have passed yesterday. Yet this road lay beneath the sea. He followed it. Soon shapes appeared in the mist. Low walls, a broken well, the outline of a chapel with no roof. Aldrich entered the ruins slowly. The chapel doorway faced west. Its floor was covered in sand. At the far end, where an altar might have stood, someone had placed dozens of small stones in stacks. Some stacks were old and crusted with salt. Others looked fresh. He found no footprints. That bothered him. Fresh offerings without fresh footprints are rarely comforting. On one wall remained a painted fragment, a blue horizon, a white bird, and a golden line separating sea from sky. Beneath it, faint letters read, "The margin is mercy." Aldrich copied the words. He did not understand them. Not yet. As he stepped outside, he heard a cartwheel creak. He froze. The sound came from the road behind him. One creak, then another, slow, heavy. Aldrich turned despite himself. Mist covered the road. Nothing moved within it. No horse snorted. No driver called. Yet the wheel continued, creaking closer, accompanied now by the faint clink of harness rings. He remembered Elian's second warning. Do not drink here. This was not that. He remembered the third. Do not look back here. Not yet either, according to the chart. Still, he had already turned. The sound stopped. Aldrich waited, heart beating hard. Then from the mist, someone whispered, "Too early." The voice was dry and amused. Aldrich did not ask what that meant. He resumed walking west at a pace just short of panic. which is a difficult speed to maintain with dignity over slippery stones. The road ended at a cove that had no business existing. Dark cliffs curved around still water. A spring trickled from the rock into a pool clear as glass. Beside it, carved into a stone, were Elian's second words, "Do not drink here." Aldrich was very thirsty. Naturally. The pool looked pure, cooler than snowmelt, sweeter than any well. He could almost feel relief in his throat just looking at it. Then he saw his reflection. It was not thirsty, it was smiling. Aldrich stepped back, took out his own water skin, and drank warm, stale water with profound appreciation. His reflection continued smiling until wind disturbed the pool. Past the cove, the vanished coastline narrowed to a ledge between waves and fog. Here, the third warning waited, carved into a standing stone. "Do not look back here." Aldrich stopped reading immediately after confirming the words. Then he faced forward. The path ahead was thin but passable. Behind him, something shifted. Pebbles clicked. Cloth rustled. A voice breathed his name in his brother's tone. He did not turn. A second voice spoke as Bren, then Torvin, then Elian, then his own voice very near his left ear said, "You dropped your journal." His hand twitched. The pack still rested against his shoulders. The journal's familiar weight pressed between spare cloth and rope. A cheap trick. Cruel, but cheap. Aldrich walked forward, eyes fixed on the ledge ahead. The sounds followed for several minutes. Footsteps matched his. Someone laughed quietly behind him. Once, fingers seemed to brush the back of his cloak. He kept walking. At last, the ledge widened, and the voices ceased. Only then did he look around. Behind him lay empty stone and mist. Ahead, the vanished coast descended toward a dark strand where the sea pulled itself in strange loops, flowing forward and sideways at once. Beyond the strand, faint and low on the horizon, he saw shapes rising from the water. Islands, a chain of them, silent beneath the mist. Aldrich checked the chart with numb fingers. Elian's dotted line ended here. From this point onward, no coast existed to guide him. He tucked the chart away and looked back toward where the lighthouse should have been. The mist hid everything. For the first time, Aldrich could not see the way home, so he turned west again, toward the islands. The strand before Aldrich looked less like a beach and more like a place where the sea had forgotten its manners. Water moved in curling bands across the sand, slipping forward, sideways, and sometimes back toward the waves that had supposedly sent it. Foam gathered into rings, broke apart, then formed again around nothing. Pebbles clicked and rolled without being touched. The whole shore seemed to breathe, but not in any rhythm Aldrich trusted. He stood at the edge with his boots sinking slowly into wet sand. The islands waited ahead, half hidden by mist. Between him and them lay shallow water broken by shoals, rocks, and dark channels. No boat rested on the strand. No pier reached out. No helpful fisherman appeared offering cheerful passage for a reasonable fee, and absolutely no unsettling questions. That would have been convenient. Convenience had clearly taken another road. Aldrich walked along the strand, searching for a crossing. The tide, if tide was even the right word here, pulled away from his feet and returned colder than before. Tiny silver fish flickered in pools, then vanished although the water remained clear. Once he saw a crab walking backward, then forward, then backward again, as if reconsidering its entire philosophy. At the far end of the beach, he found a line of flat stones leading into the shallows. They were not natural. Each stone bore a shallow cup carved into its center, filled with seawater that did not spill even when waves washed over it. The cups reflected the sky, but the sky in them was darker, full of stars. Aldrich looked upward. Daylight hid behind gray clouds. He looked back down. Stars shimmered in the little pools. "Of course," he murmured. "Why should puddles behave?" He stepped onto the first stone. It held firm. Then the second. The third shifted slightly, but not enough to throw him. He continued slowly, using his staff for balance. Water surged around his boots. The cold climbed his legs. The mist thickened until the beach behind him disappeared. Halfway across, he heard singing. Not loud, not near. A low, wavering song rose from somewhere over the water. No words carried clearly, only the shape of a melody, sad and patient. It reminded him of women singing while washing clothes by a river in his childhood village. Though this tune bent in places no village song should bend. Aldrich did not answer. He had become remarkably good at not answering things. This, honestly, was growth. The stones ended at a shoal of black rock, slick with weed. Beyond it, the first island rose from the mist, low, narrow, and crowded with pale grass. He climbed onto it with hands numb from spray and stood dripping beneath a sky that had begun to brighten strangely in the west. The island was silent, not quiet, silent. No gulls, no insects, no wind in the grass, though the mist moved around him. Even his own breathing seemed softened. When he took a step, the sound arrived a heartbeat late. Aldrich disliked that very much. The island held ruins, small ones, stone huts with collapsed roofs, a circular enclosure, and a row of posts carved into shapes like seated birds. In the center stood a well, though the island seemed too low and salty for fresh water. A rope hung from the crossbeam. The bucket rested beside the stones, dry and cracked. He did not drink. He was learning. On the inner wall of the well, someone had carved names, dozens of them, some old, some newer. Aldrich found Edrin Vale among them, scratched hastily near the rim. Beside it was a symbol, the eye over the ship. Underneath, in smaller letters, "Sound dies first." Aldrich tested this by tapping the well stone with his knuckle. He saw the impact, felt it, heard nothing. A chill moved through him. He backed away. Among the ruined huts, he found scraps of evidence left by travelers. A broken compass needle, a rusted buckle, a strip of parchment sealed in wax, and a wooden spoon carved with little moons along its handle. The parchment had survived only in pieces. One phrase remained clear: "The animals know the border and refuse it." That seemed dramatic until Aldrich reached the island's western shore. There, dozens of fish lay in the shallows, alive but still, facing east. Their silver bodies barely moved. Crabs clustered behind them. Even limpets seemed gathered on the eastern sides of rocks, as if every small creature had decided the western water was not worth investigating. Aldrich respected this opinion. Unfortunately, he did not share it. He followed a narrow ridge of stone toward the next island, crossing during a lull in the restless tide. The second island was taller and crowned with leaning stones. Unlike the first, it made sound, but too much of it. Every footstep echoed several times. Aldrich coughed once and heard the cough return from 3 directions, then 5, then from somewhere beneath the ground. He whispered, "Aldrich," very softly, as an experiment. The island whispered back, "Aldrich, Aldrich, Aldrich," until the name faded into something almost unfamiliar. That was enough science for the moment. The leaning stones formed a circle around a flat slab. On the slab sat a bronze bowl filled with rainwater. Beside it lay shells, pins, beads, and tiny folded scraps of cloth. Offerings again. One scrap had been weighted by a pebble. Aldrich opened it carefully. Inside, written in a faded hand, were the words, "We left his echo here so he could go on." Aldrich folded the cloth exactly as he had found it and put it back. There was an old belief in some coastal villages that echoes were pieces of the soul, loosened by cliffs and caves. Mothers warned children not to shout too often in hollows, lest they become thin of spirit and annoying at supper. This was nonsense, probably, but standing there among stones that repeated every breath, Aldrich felt less eager to test it. From the second island, he saw more shapes westward. A chain indeed, each island different, each waiting. He crossed to the third as afternoon dimmed. This one was covered in white shells, so densely they crunched underfoot like frost. At its center stood a wooden frame from which hung dozens of small bells. None rang, though the wind finally moved here, combing through Aldrich's wet cloak and the pale grass. The bells were made from different things: bronze, shell, bone, glass. One appeared to be carved from a large tooth, which Aldrich tried very hard not to identify. Under the frame lay a stone marked with Edrin Vale's symbol again. Below it, "When the bells ring, count none of them." That sounded easy until dusk came. As Aldrich made camp beneath a low rock ledge, the first bell chimed, soft, clear, then another, then three at once. Soon the whole frame trembled with music, though no wind touched it now. The bells rang in patterns, pausing as if inviting him to count. Aldrich closed his eyes. One part of his mind began anyway. 1, 2, 3. He bit the inside of his cheek, not hard enough to draw blood, just enough to interrupt the thought. Instead, he recited useless facts: the price of oats in Eastmere, the names of Bren's mule's imagined ancestors. Every insult he had ever heard applied to bad soup. This worked surprisingly well. By midnight, the bells stopped. Aldrich slept poorly. In the morning, he found one bell lying beside him. It was small, silver, and warm. He left it where it lay. No souvenir was worth becoming part of a warning. The fourth island rose steeply from the water, shaped like a broken crown. Climbing it required both hands and several unkind remarks about stone. At the top, he found the remains of a watch platform and a view over the surrounding sea. The water beyond the islands was different, darker, smoother. It lay in a wide band across the west, unbroken by ordinary waves. Mist hovered above it in vertical sheets. Far beyond, something pale flashed and vanished. Not lightning, too steady, too low. Aldrich felt the bronze token grow cold in his pouch. Behind him, the islands stretched back into fog, each one holding its silence, echoes, bells, and warnings. Ahead, the sea waited with the patience of a closed eye. He opened his journal and wrote, "The nearer I come, the less the world behaves as if it expects to continue." Then he packed his things and climbed down toward the final crossing, where the strange water began. The final island waited beyond a channel, so still it looked less like water than polished metal. Aldrich stood on the black rocks and studied it. The crossing was short, perhaps 30 paces, but the water between seemed deep. No foam touched its surface, no fish moved below. His reflection stared up from it clearly, though the sky above remained fog-white and blank. That felt unnecessary. A man's reflection should not be more certain than the man himself. A broken causeway ran beneath the surface, visible as pale stones just low enough to make the crossing irritating. Aldrich stepped down carefully. Water rose to his knees, then his thighs, cold enough to make his bones reconsider their arrangement. Halfway across, his reflection changed. It stopped matching him. Reflected, Aldrich remained still, standing upright in the water, watching with calm eyes while real Aldrich continued forward like a damp, nervous idiot. Aldrich did not stop. He had learned by now that strange things near the western boundary were often invitations disguised as surprises. You noticed them, and then they gained weight. So he looked at the island ahead, not down, not back, ahead. When he reached shore, the reflection was gone. The final island was larger than the others, and shaped like a long sleeping beast, its back covered in gray grass and low stone ruins. A ridge ran along its center. At the far western end stood a cluster of pillars, broken but tall, leaning toward the sea. Aldrich climbed slowly. His wet clothing clung to him. Salt dried on his face. Every step squelched in his boots with a tragic lack of dignity. If anyone had imagined reaching the world's edge involved noble silhouettes and billowing cloaks, Aldrich could now report that it mostly involved chafing. Near the ridge he found the first relic, a sword, not buried, not displayed, simply laid across two stones, clean of rust despite the sea air. Its grip was wrapped in dark leather. Its blade bore no jewels, no royal marks, no heroic nonsense. Only a short inscription ran along the fuller, "For the road that cannot be cut." Aldrich did not pick it up. He was no swordsman, and besides, objects left too neatly in abandoned places usually wanted attention. Attention was becoming expensive. Farther on, he found a pilgrim's staff planted upright in the earth. Shell badges still hung from its top, faded and cracked. Around it, someone had tied strips of cloth bearing prayers in several hands. One prayer read, "Let him return with his own shadow." Aldrich glanced at the ground. His shadow lay faint beside him in the fog-filtered light. Good. Probably, he continued. The ridge descended into a hollow filled with cairns. Some were simple heaps of stone. Others had been built carefully, with shells pressed into their sides and bits of colored glass set near the top. Names were carved into flat markers before them. Most names had worn away, but not all. Mareth of Dunwick, Sister Aaliyah, Thomas Reedhand, Pell who drew the western wind, Edrin Vale. Aldrich stopped. Edrin's cairn stood apart, not larger, but stranger. Instead of shells, it was decorated with small bronze tokens like the one Aldrich carried. Ships on one side, eyes on the other. Some were green with age. Some looked freshly polished. Aldrich took out his token and held it in his palm. It matched perfectly. He placed it atop the cairn. For a moment, the mist seemed to lean closer. Then the tokens clicked softly together, though no hand touched them. Aldrich exhaled. "May your notes have been clearer than your reputation," he said. That seemed respectful enough. Behind the cairn lay a stone box sealed with wax and pitch. The seal had long cracked. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were pages from a journal. Edrin Vale's journal. Aldrich recognized the name written on the first sheet, along with the eye and ship symbol. The pages were brittle but readable. He sat on a stone and worked through them carefully, sheltering them from mist with his cloak. Edrin had come seeking the same thing. The margin of the world, the last boundary, the place where maps failed because reality itself grew thin. His crew had crossed the moor, stayed in Salomir, reached the lighthouse, and followed the vanished coast. They had found the islands. Then they began losing things, not supplies, not people, at first, certainties. One sailor forgot the taste of apples. Another could no longer remember whether he had ever had a mother. A scholar woke speaking only in questions. The priest heard confession from his own echo, and apparently found the echo more honest, which must have been awkward for everyone involved. One page described the first island as a place where sound falls asleep. Another described the bells. Aldrich skimmed faster. The final entries changed in tone. Edrin's careful script grew uneven. The western water is not empty, it is waiting. The margin does not destroy, it separates. No man reaches the edge carrying all he brought. And finally, to cross farther, one must leave behind the proof of arrival. Aldrich read that line several times. It was exactly the kind of sentence scholars loved and travelers hated. Leave behind the proof of arrival. His journal, his maps, his name, his common sense, though arguably that had been abandoned weeks earlier. He folded the pages and returned them to the stone box. He did not take them. Edrin had already said enough. At the western end of the island, the pillars rose from a platform of pale stone. There were 7 of them, each carved with scenes worn by salt and time. On the first, travelers walked beneath stars. On the second, ships crossed curling seas. On the third, people stood before cliffs. On the fourth, a figure placed a book upon an altar. On the fifth, hands released birds. On the sixth, faces turned away from a bright horizon. On the seventh, nothing was carved at all. Its blankness felt deliberate. Beside the 7th pillar sat a small altar. On it lay objects left by earlier seekers, a compass without a needle, a ring, a child's carved toy horse, a cracked astrolabe, 3 quills tied with blue thread, and a leather-bound book, swollen by damp. Aldrich understood then, the proof of arrival. Each traveler had left something that would have helped them convince the world, something valuable, something personal, something that said, I was here. The margin demanded humility before passage. How rude, how oddly fair. Aldrich touched his journal through his pack and felt a sudden fierce protectiveness. Every note, every map, every warning, every foolish little comment about soup and weather lived inside it. Without it, who would believe him? Then again, Edrin's journal had remained here, and still Aldrich had found the path. Perhaps some stories returned differently, not as proof, as invitation. He looked west. Beyond the pillars, the strange sea stretched outward, dark and smooth beneath hanging mist. Somewhere far away, pale light flashed again, low on the horizon. The air tasted metallic. The quiet pressed close. Aldrich removed from his pack the copied chart from Keeper Elian. Not his journal. Not yet. The chart had guided him over the vanished coast, but its line ended here. Beyond this island, it offered nothing. It had done its work. He placed it on the altar. The damp air lifted one corner as if inspecting the gift. Then the chart darkened, slowly, like ink sinking into water, until the lines vanished from the parchment. Aldrich felt a tremor pass through the stone beneath his boots. Below the platform, something moved in the sea. Not a creature. A path. A line of pale water appeared westward from the island, narrow and shimmering, like moonlight laid across the surface, though no moon showed above. It extended into the mist, pointing toward the place where the pale light flashed. Aldrich smiled, despite himself. Well, he whispered, that is dramatic. From behind him came the faintest echo of bells. Not counting bells. Farewell bells. At least, he chose to believe that. Travelers must be allowed some comforting interpretations, or they will become unbearable company. He tightened his pack, checked the blue thread around his wrist, and stepped down from the platform. The islands behind him held their relics, their warnings, and their patient dead. The path ahead waited over strange water. Aldrich followed it west. The pale path held beneath Aldrich's boots, though it should not have held anything at all. It was not stone, not ice, not wood hidden beneath the surface. It was water, shining faintly under the mist, firm only where his weight touched it. Each step sent ripples outward in slow silver rings. Beneath the surface, darkness descended so deeply that his eyes refused to follow. Aldrich kept his gaze ahead. That had become one of the journey's reliable lessons. Ahead was usually safer than behind, below, or anywhere. Reflections felt too enthusiastic. The islands faded quickly, their shapes blurred into gray, then vanished. Soon there was only the narrow shining way, the strange dark sea on either side, and the low pulse of pale light far west. The air grew warmer. That was almost worse than cold. Warmth should have been comforting, but out here it felt borrowed from some season that did not belong. Mist curled around him in long ropes. His cloak dried slowly. Salt stiffened the edges of his sleeves. Then the wind died, completely. Aldrich stopped. The silence became enormous. For a moment he could hear his heart, his breath, the creak of leather straps, and somewhere far beneath him, a faint grinding sound, as if mountains slept under the sea and dreamed with their teeth. He moved on. After some time, the pale path widened. Waves began to rise on either side, though no wind drove them. At first they lifted gently, black shoulders swelling from the sea. Then they grew taller, curling inward, forming walls of water beside the path. Aldrich swallowed. The water did not fall, it hung there. On both sides, the sea rose higher than a house, higher than a church roof, dark and trembling, full of suspended foam and drifting strands of weed. Within those walls he saw things caught in the water. Fish, broken oars, a boot, a silver cup, a door still on its hinges, and a small wooden saint with both hands raised as if equally surprised by the situation. Aldrich understood the saint's feelings. The path continued through the parted sea. He walked faster, not running. Running would imply panic, and panic had poor footing. Halfway through the watery corridor, the storm arrived. It did not approach from the horizon. It unfolded. Clouds opened above him like dark sails. Thunder rolled without warning, so deep it seemed to come from below, as much as from the sky. The walls of water shuddered. Rain fell upward for 3 breaths, then sideways, then down with sudden violence. Aldrich hunched beneath it. The pale path flickered. "Ah," he muttered, "so now we discuss terms." Lightning flashed inside the water walls. For one blinding instant he saw faces in the suspended sea. Not corpses, not exactly. Faces shaped from foam, weed, and bubbles. Men and women, old and young, all turned toward him with open eyes. Their mouths moved, but thunder swallowed whatever they said. A wave broke over the path. Aldrich staggered. Cold water slammed into his side and nearly tore the staff from his hand. He dropped to one knee. The shining surface dipped beneath him, suddenly soft. For a horrible second, his boot sank. He pushed forward, scrambling, fingers numb, pack dragging heavy on his shoulders. The path hardened again beneath his palms. He stood, gasping. Behind him, the sea closed over the place where he had fallen. Ahead, the pale light pulsed brighter. The storm gathered itself. Wind struck from the west, fierce and sharp. It drove rain into his face. His hood tore back. His hair whipped across his eyes. The path narrowed until it was barely wider than his shoulders. This, Aldrich thought, was unnecessarily theatrical. If the world wished to discourage visitors, a locked gate would have done nicely. Another wave crashed across the path. This time he braced himself, leaning into his staff. Water surged around his legs but did not take him. He began counting steps, not bells, Steps 1, 2, 3. Simple numbers tied him to himself. 10, 20, 30. The storm screamed. At 47, he heard his brother's voice, not behind, above. "Aldrich!" He did not look up. At 62, Bren shouted from the left, "Wrong way!" At 70, Keeper Elian's voice said, "The light has gone out." That almost made him turn. Almost. At 88, his own voice whispered, "You can still wake." He laughed then. It came out ragged, soaked, and half-mad. "Wonderful offer," he said. "Poor timing." A curious fact came to him from nowhere, perhaps because fear enjoys strange company. Some medieval sailors believed storms could be softened by throwing stale bread into the sea, as if the weather were merely hungry and somewhat rude. Aldrich considered offering his remaining barley cakes, but the storm looked far too ambitious for snacks. Thunder cracked. The path vanished. Aldrich fell. For one breath, there was no up or down, only cold, dark, noise. His pack dragged him sideways. Water filled his ears. He kicked, struck something solid with his knee, and reached blindly. His hand closed around rope. Impossible rope. Thick, wet, and rough, hanging in the water like the line of a bell. He gripped it with both hands. The current pulled. His shoulders burned. The rope jerked once, twice, then began rising. Aldrich clung to it while the sea roared around him. He broke the surface beneath a sky full of white fire. The rope led upward into mist. No bell hung above it, no mast, no cliff. Still it lifted him, drawing him from the water until his boots found the pale path again. He collapsed onto it, coughing hard enough to worry any nearby dignity. The rope slipped from his hands and fell soundlessly into the sea. Aldrich lay on his back, rain striking his face. For a while, he did not move. Then he began laughing. Not because anything was funny, because he was alive. And the body sometimes celebrates survival with sounds that would concern polite company. He rolled onto his side and checked his pack, soaked, his food nearly ruined, his spare clothes wet, but his journal, wrapped in oilskin, remained dry. He held it against his chest for a moment. Then the storm changed. The thunder softened. The rain thinned. The walls of water lowered into ordinary waves, though ordinary had become a generous word. The wind shifted east, pushing mist apart. Ahead, the pale path ended. Beyond it lay open water under a sky clearing to deep blue-black. Stars shone there. Not evening stars, not morning stars, unfamiliar stars. Aldrich rose unsteadily. Behind him, storm clouds closed like a curtain over the way he had come. The islands were gone. The vanished coast was gone. The lighthouse was gone. Before him stretched waters no chart had ever held. He took one step off the pale path and found a narrow strip of floating dark stone beneath the surface, just enough to carry him forward. The storm beyond all storms had not stopped him. It had delivered him. Aldrich wiped rain from his face, tightened his grip on his staff, and walked beneath strange stars toward the deeper west. The stars above Aldrich were wrong, not ugly, not threatening. Just wrong, in the quiet, confident way of a stranger sitting in your chair and acting surprised when you object. He knew the common constellations well enough to travel: the hunter, the crown, the river maid, the crooked line sailors called the broken oar. None stood where they should. Some were missing entirely. Others had appeared in unfamiliar clusters, bright and sharp, as if someone had spilled salt across black cloth and then arranged it with mysterious intentions. Aldrich stopped on the floating stone and turned slowly. The sky offered no north, no east, no honest guidance at all. His compass was equally unhelpful. The needle spun once, trembled, then pointed downward. Aldrich stared at it. "Well," he said softly, That is new. He tucked it away before it could become more discouraging. The path beneath him was barely visible, a chain of dark stone just under the water's skin. Each step made the surface ripple with faint green light. Around him, the sea stretched smooth and endless, reflecting stars that did not match the heavens above. Some reflections moved even when their stars did not. He chose not to investigate. This was becoming a theme. After the violence of the storm, the calm felt almost unreal. No wind touched his face, no waves broke. His wet clothes hung heavy, but no longer chilled him. The air smelled faintly sweet, like rain on summer hay, though no land was visible. Then he heard wings. A bird passed overhead, silent except for the soft beat of feathers. It was white, long-necked, and larger than any swan he had ever seen. Another followed, then 5 more. They flew west in a perfect line, each carrying something dark in its beak. Aldrich watched until they vanished among the strange stars. Soon after, he found what they had dropped. A black seed floated beside the path, round and glossy. Then another, then dozens. They drifted in clusters on the still water, each no larger than a pea. One bumped gently against the submerged stone near his boot. He did not pick it up. At this point, Aldrich's survival depended less on courage and more on refusing free objects. A little farther on, the path widened into a circular platform just beneath the surface. At its center stood a dry stone, rising waist-high from the sea. On the stone rested a clay lamp, unlit but warm. Beside it lay a scrap of cloth marked with a familiar symbol, the eye over the ship. Edrin Vale again. Aldrich unfolded the cloth. The writing was faded but legible. When stars forget their duties, follow what casts no shadow. He read the line twice. Then he looked around. Everything cast a reflection. Nothing cast a shadow, because the light came from everywhere and nowhere. Very helpful, Edrin. Truly, scholars had a gift for making desperation sound elegant. Aldrich sat on the platform to wring water from his cloak. The sea around him remained perfectly still. In the distance, pale shapes moved beneath the surface, large, slow, and too deep to identify. They gave off a faint glow as they passed under the path. He ate a softened barley cake and a strip of smoked fish. The cake had absorbed seawater and now tasted like sadness with grain in it. Still, food was food. A man does not insult supper too loudly when supper is all he has. While he rested, he noticed something odd. The clay lamp on the stone had no flame, yet it cast a small dark patch behind it, a shadow. Aldrich leaned closer. The shadow pointed west. He laughed under his breath. "Follow what casts no shadow," he murmured. "Of course it means the lamp casting a shadow without light. Why would it not?" He lifted the lamp. The shadow remained on the stone, still pointing west, as if the lamp had only revealed it rather than made it. Aldrich set the lamp down carefully and followed the direction. The submerged stones continued there, invisible until he stepped near them. Each one appeared moments before his boot touched, then faded behind him. Navigation had become an act of trust, which Aldrich found deeply unfair. He preferred maps. Maps did not usually wait until the last possible second to exist. After what felt like hours, the silence broke. A low hum rose from the sea. At first he thought it was wind returning, but the water remained still. The hum deepened, becoming many tones braided together. It seemed to come from beneath the path, from the large glowing shapes moving below. Whales, perhaps, or something older, wearing the idea of whales. Aldrich remembered a curious belief from distant fishermen. Some claimed whales sang the world's boundaries into place. each dawn, and that if they ever stopped, the seas would forget where to rest. He had once laughed at that. He did not laugh now. The song vibrated through his boots. His bones answered, not painfully, gently, as if something vast were reminding him that he was small, temporary, and lucky to be tolerated. The path bent southwest, then west, then impossibly upward. Aldrich paused. The stones ahead rose from the water, one after another, forming a stair that climbed into mist. No cliff supported it, no island waited above. It simply ascended, each step slick and dark beneath starlight. His legs objected, his back objected. His entire damp person filed a complaint. He climbed anyway. The higher he rose, the farther the sea spread below. Soon he looked down upon the water as if from a tower. The strange stars reflected across it in endless trembling patterns. Behind him, nothing showed the route he had taken. Ahead, the mist thinned. A horizon appeared, not flat, not curved, broken. A jagged pale line stretched across the west, immense and distant, glowing faintly beneath the star-wrung sky. At first, Aldrich thought it was cloud. Then lightning flickered along its base, revealing vertical walls, cliffs, vast cliffs rising from the sea. His breath caught. The world's margin. Perhaps. The stair ended on nothing. Aldrich stepped from the final stone and found himself standing on a narrow strip of black sand. The sea lay behind him. Before him, across a plain of shallow water and glassy pools, the cliffs rose higher than any mountain wall he had seen. They were still far away, but their presence changed the air. Everything seemed to lean toward them. The stars, the sea, his own thoughts. Aldrich opened his journal with careful, shaking hands and wrote, "I have passed beyond known navigation. The heavens are altered. A cliff line stands in the west. I cannot say whether it is the world's end, but the world appears to think so." Then he closed the journal and looked up. Between him and the cliffs, faint lights moved across the water. Not false lights, not lanterns. These were steady and blue, arranged in a line like markers on a road. Aldrich adjusted his pack. He was tired beyond proper words. But the cliffs waited. And for the first time since leaving Salomir, he felt not fear, not exactly, but awe so deep it quieted even his questions. He followed the blue lights across the shallow sea beneath the unfamiliar stars. The blue lights led Aldrich over water, shallow enough to show the dark sand beneath. They hovered just above the surface, each no brighter than a candle seen through thick glass. When he came near, a light dimmed behind him, and another appeared ahead, keeping the line always moving west. It was considerate, in the way. A mysterious path across impossible waters can be considered considerate, which is to say, not very, but one takes what one can get. The cliffs grew larger with every step. At first they had seemed distant, pale, almost dreamlike. Now they rose with dreadful clarity from the western sea, a wall so vast that Aldrich's mind kept failing to measure it. Their faces were white stone, veined with silver and blue. Water streamed down them in thin, shining lines, though no river fed them from above. Their tops vanished into high mist, where strange stars glittered like frost caught in wool. The sound reached him long before the base, a low, endless thunder, not storm thunder, falling water. The sea ahead poured somewhere beyond sight. Aldrich slowed. His mouth went dry. For weeks, every rumor had pointed here. Sailors whispering over ale, maps ending in blank parchment, boundary stones, vanished coasts, bells in fog, Edrin's relics, Keeper Elian's flame. He had followed all of it across the world's loosening seams, and now the world roared before him. The shallow water ended at a stretch of black stone. Aldrich climbed onto it and found it warm beneath his boots. The blue lights drifted ahead through narrow channels cut into the rock, where seawater ran westward in quick silver streams. He followed until the ground rose. The slope was gentle at first, then steep. Steps appeared, carved directly into the stone. Some were large enough for giants, others awkwardly narrow, as if made by builders who had only heard rumors about human legs and guessed poorly. Aldrich climbed. His knees complained. His breath shortened. His pack seemed to gain weight with every step, perhaps by absorbing philosophical dread. Near the first landing, he found carvings covering the cliff base. They stretched farther than he could see. Animals, ships, stars, hands, eyes, spirals, waves, and figures standing before a jagged line. Some carvings were ancient and softened by salt. Others looked fresh enough that he wondered who had made them and whether they had gone on or turned back. One image caught him sharply. A traveler kneeling beside a book. Behind the traveler, a road. Before him, a blank door. Aldrich touched his journal through his pack. Not yet. He continued upward. The steps led to a ledge wide enough to walk along the cliff face. From there, Aldrich saw the truth of the margin. The ocean did not simply meet the cliffs. It fell. Far to his left, the sea rushed through a gap in the stone and dropped into a white void beyond. Mist surged upward from below, glowing faintly with hidden light. The roar was immense, steady, and strangely soft at its edges, like the world breathing in its sleep. Aldrich gripped the cliff wall. He had seen waterfalls before, mountain torrents, river cataracts, nothing like this. Here, the sea itself poured over an unseen boundary, vanishing beyond the edge of the known earth. "Ah," he whispered, so the drunk sailor was not entirely drunk. That seemed worth noting. A ridiculous little laugh escaped him. Not mocking, not even amused, just overwhelmed. There are moments when the mind, faced with too much wonder, sends humor ahead like a nervous servant to check whether the room is safe. It was not safe, but it was magnificent. He walked along the ledge. The cliffs were not smooth. They were honeycombed with arches, openings, and shallow caves. Some caves held pools of still water. Others held stacked stones, scraps of cloth, rusted tools, and offerings left by seekers who had reached this place before him. At one opening, he found a row of clay cups turned upside down. An old marginal custom came to mind. In certain coastal hermitages, cups were inverted after a vigil to show that the drinker had emptied not only the vessel, but also his questions. Aldrich suspected this was very noble. He also suspected most people simply disliked washing cups in cold weather. Farther along, the ledge widened into a terrace. At its center stood a stone arch with no wall around it. Beyond the arch was only mist. The blue lights gathered there, circling slowly. Aldrich approached. On the inner curve of the arch, words had been carved in many languages. He recognized only a few. Here the world turns its face away. Here all roads become questions. Here names are weighed against silence. Beneath those older lines, in Edrin Vale's hand, appeared another. The edge is not an ending. It is a threshold that prefers humility. Aldrich stood beneath the arch and looked out. The mist parted. For one breath, he saw beyond the cliffs. Not empty darkness, not a fiery abyss, not the bottom of creation, neatly labeled for travelers. He saw light, a vast low brightness stretching beyond the falling sea. Shapes moved within it, impossible to hold in thought. Perhaps clouds, perhaps lands, perhaps the backs of sleeping mountains. The sight slipped away whenever he tried to focus on it. Then the mist closed again. Aldrich stepped back, trembling. This was the world's margin, yes, but not the simple edge he had imagined as a child. Not a place where earth stopped and nothing began. It was a seam, a border, a veil, where one order of things ended and another quietly waited. He laughed again, softer this time. All this way, he murmured, and the world refuses to be tidy. Typical. At the far side of the terrace stood a narrow stair, climbing toward a higher shelf. The blue lights did not follow. They remained circling the arch, as if their duty ended there. Aldrich climbed alone. The stair brought him to a ledge overlooking both the falling sea and the black waters he had crossed. Behind him, the strange stars burned cold and unfamiliar. Below, mist rose from the world's drop in endless folds. At the ledge's edge stood a single stone pillar, blank, no carvings, no warnings, no helpful little sentence from Edrin, which felt almost rude after all their correspondence. On top of the pillar lay a shallow basin filled with clear water. Aldrich leaned over it. No reflection looked back. Instead, the basin showed the road behind him, the islands, the vanished coast, the lighthouse, Salomir, the moor, the mapmaker's workshop. Each appeared briefly, then faded. At last the water showed Aldrich himself standing on the ridge where Bren had left him, about to descend into the empty west. The image waited. A question without words. Return? Aldrich looked from the basin to the arch below, then to the mist beyond the falling sea. His journey had reached the cliffs at the world's margin, but the edge, it seemed, had not finished with him. Aldrich stood before the basin for a long while, watching his younger self hesitate on the ridge above the empty west. It was a strange thing, seeing a moment already lived. Stranger still to notice how small he looked. Back then, he had believed himself prepared. Cloak fastened, pack balanced, journal blank enough to welcome wonders. He had thought the unknown waited ahead like a locked chest, and if he were clever, stubborn, or lucky enough, he might open it and carry home whatever treasure lay inside. Now, at the world's margin, soaked in salt and awe, he understood the unknown was not a chest. It was weather. It entered through seams. It changed the shape of what carried it. The basin showed him other scenes, a line of travelers crossing the Marker Valley, Keeper Elian as a young woman lighting the tower beside an older man with the same calm eyes. Old Mara, standing as a child on the shore of Salomir, watching blue fire split the horizon. Edrin Vale kneeling at the island altar, weeping quietly as he placed his journal down. Then the water clouded. Aldrich leaned closer. A voice spoke behind him. "You brought less than most." He turned. A figure stood near the blank pillar. Not a monster. Not a ghost. Exactly. A person-shaped presence wrapped in pale gray garments that shifted like mist. Its face was difficult to remember while looking directly at it. One moment old. Another young. One moment. Masculine. Another feminine. Then neither. Then both. Like a candle flame refusing to be drawn accurately. Aldrich's hand went to his knife. The figure tilted its head. "That will be useful only if you intend to stab the horizon." Aldrich paused, then lowered his hand. "Fair point." The figure looked toward the falling sea. Few arrive with humor intact. "I almost lost it in the moor." "Many do." "Are you the keeper of this place?" "One of its manners." That was not an answer. By now, Aldrich had developed tolerance for unhelpful truth. The figure moved to the basin, though its feet made no sound. The water cleared again. This time it showed not the road behind, but the cliffs from far above. Aldrich saw the sea flowing toward the margin in vast dark folds. He saw mist rising beyond. He saw the arch below, tiny against the enormous white stone. Then the vision widened. The world appeared like a map, but alive. Forests breathing mist, rivers flashing silver, cities glowing like embers, roads threading through kingdoms, mountains folded like sleeping beasts. Around all of it lay borders Aldrich had never imagined, not one edge, but many. Margins within margins, places where desert met dream, where northern ice held old lights, where deep forests remembered paths men forgot. The world has no single ending, the figure said. Only places where certainty grows thin. Aldrich watched, unable to speak. The map shifted again. He saw travelers throughout ages. Sailors, monks, shepherds, queens in disguise, children following strange birds, prisoners escaping toward impossible valleys. Each reached some boundary. Some turned back. Some crossed. Some became stories so altered that no one believed they had once been people. "Then this is not the edge," Aldrich said at last. "It is an edge. That feels like cheating." The figure's almost face suggested amusement. Men prefer the world to match their grammar. Aldrich could not really argue. Below, the sea thundered endlessly over the margin. The sound filled his bones, but no longer frightened him. It was too vast for fear alone. It was like hearing a secret spoken by stone, water, and sky, all at once. "What lies beyond?" he asked. The figure looked through the arch below. Beyond. Again, not helpful. Again, possibly the only honest answer. The basin darkened. Now it showed Aldrich's journal, page after page turned by an unseen hand. His sketches of stones, notes about false lights, warnings, names, jokes, complaints about weather, uncertain theories, little records of meals and fear. The pages looked fragile in the water's vision. "Proof," the figure said. "Yes." "Burden." "Also yes." "Anchor." Aldrich frowned. The figure touched the water. Ripples passed over the image. "Every traveler comes here wanting to carry back the edge. A stone, a map, a chart, a sentence sharp enough to cut disbelief. But the margin cannot be carried like a coin in a pouch." "I only wanted to understand." "No," said the figure gently. "You wanted understanding that would obey you." That landed harder than Aldrich expected. He opened his mouth, found no clever reply, and closed it again. Very rare, almost historic. The figure gestured toward the carvings below. "Those who leave proof may pass farther. Those who keep proof may return. Those who cling to both are broken by the asking." Aldrich looked down toward the arch, where mist hid the brightness beyond. "So that is the choice. Soon. Why show me this first? Because secrets are lighter when named." The basin changed once more. It showed a memory Aldrich had not written anywhere. His brother Corin, lying feverish beneath wool blankets, whispering about all the places he would see when he recovered. Aldrich had promised to tell him about every road, every mountain, every sea. Corin had smiled. Then spring rain had filled the ditches, and the fever had taken him before dawn. Aldrich looked away. The figure said nothing. For all its strangeness, it allowed silence kindly. At last, Aldrich whispered, "I kept traveling for him, and for yourself." "Yes." The admission felt simple. Painful, but simple. The world's margin had not revealed a pile of treasure, a golden gate, or a convenient answer wrapped in ribbon. It revealed the shape of desire beneath the journey. Not merely curiosity, not merely defiance, a promise, a grief, a hunger to prove that distance could make loss meaningful. Aldrich almost laughed. Imagine walking to the edge of the world only to be handed your own heart like an unpaid bill. Very rude, very effective. The figure reached into the basin and drew out a drop of water, bright as a star. It floated above its palm. One secret then, traveler. The edge does not show men where the world ends. It shows them where they do. The drop fell back into the basin. The vision vanished. Only clear water remained. Aldrich stood quietly, listening to the sea pour beyond all maps. He understood now why Edrin had left his journal, why others had left rings, toys, tools, charts. The offering was not payment, it was release. A traveler could not cross while dragging the whole old self behind him, demanding witnesses. Below, the arch waited. Beyond it, brightness breathed within mist. Behind him lay every road home. Aldrich touched his journal. Its oilskin cover was worn from rain salt and his own anxious hands. Inside lived the proof of everything, also the weight. The figure stepped back from the pillar. "When you descend," it said, "the choice will meet you." Aldrich nodded. He took one final look into the basin. This time it showed nothing but his own reflection. Tired, salt-streaked, older than when he began. Still himself, mostly. He smiled faintly. Mostly will have to do. Then he turned from the blank pillar and began descending toward the arch at the world's margin. The stair down from the blank pillar felt longer than it had before. Aldrich descended slowly, one hand against the cold cliff wall, the other resting on the strap of his pack. Below him, the stone arch waited on its terrace while mist curled through it in long, pale folds. The blue light still circled there, dimmer now, as though whatever had guided him across the shallows had nearly finished its duty. The roar of the falling sea filled everything, yet beneath that roar, Aldrich heard a quieter sound, pages turning. He stopped. The sound came from his pack, not loudly, just the soft, dry whisper of parchment shifting in a room where no wind should be. Aldrich closed his eyes. "Not subtle," he murmured. The world's margin, apparently, had the manners of a creditor tapping politely at the door. At the foot of the stair, he crossed the terrace toward the arch. The carvings along the stone seemed clearer now. Travelers releasing birds, hands opening, faces turned away from bright horizons. Not warnings exactly, instructions perhaps, or reminders left by those who had stood here and realized that arrival was not the final task. At the arch, the mist parted. Beyond it lay the brightness he had glimpsed before. Not a road, not a kingdom, not a neat continuation of everything he knew. It was a wide silver hush, full of shapes that refused to become objects. There were suggestions of towers, forests, sails, mountains, and enormous wings folded in sleep, but whenever Aldrich tried to focus, they softened into light. The space beyond seemed less like a place than a promise too large for speech. The figure from the basin stood beside the arch, or perhaps it had always been there. "One step," it said, "and you cross. And if I cross, you will know what lies beyond. And return, not with proof." Aldrich already knew. Still, hearing it spoken pressed the truth into him like a seal into wax. He removed his pack and set it on the stone. Inside were food, rope, tools, spare cloth, a useless compass, the shell from old Mara, and his journal wrapped carefully in oilskin. He drew the journal out and held it with both hands. It seemed heavier than it should. Absurdly heavier. All those pages, all that ink, all those careful lines meant to convince strangers that he had truly passed beyond the western roads, crossed the moor, reached the hidden coast, walked the islands, survived the storm, and stood at the margin where the sea fell out of the known world. Without the journal, the tale would become smoke. People would doubt. Scholars would argue. Sailors would improve it irresponsibly. Someone would add a dragon by the third retelling, almost certainly. People cannot resist adding dragons where none are needed. It is one of humanity's more decorative flaws. Aldrich opened the journal. The first pages showed the old mapmaker's wall, the unfinished coastline, the earliest rumors. Then came sketches of boundary stones, notes about Wysella, warnings from Salomir, Keeper Elion's chart, the vanished coast, the islands, Edrin's tokens, the storm, the wrong stars, the cliffs. His life had narrowed into ink. No, not narrowed, gathered. He looked through the arch again. The brightness breathed softly. The figure waited. What did others choose? Aldrich asked. Some crossed. What became of them? They became what they met. And those who returned, they became what they carried. That was better than most answers here, though still annoying. Aldrich thought of Edrin Vale. His journal left behind on the island, his name surviving in fragments, his proof surrendered, so another might come farther. Perhaps Edrin had crossed. Perhaps he had turned back, changed beyond telling. Perhaps the empty boat that returned to Salomir had carried not failure, but mercy. He thought of Corin. His little brother had wanted stories, not evidence. He would have cared more about the color of the strange stars than whether a compass confirmed them. He would have laughed at the mule named Porridge. He would have insisted the singing water was obviously lonely and should be sung to, which was exactly why Corin would have been eaten by a mystery within minutes. Aldrich smiled sadly. Then he closed the journal. He did not place it on the altar. Not yet. Instead, he took one blank page from the back. Carefully, using his knife, he cut it free. On it, he wrote only this: "The world does not end where men stop knowing it. At every margin, something waits, and what waits asks what you are willing to leave behind." He let the ink dry. Then he folded the page around the bronze token's faint green stain still left on his fingers, though the token itself had been placed on Edrin's cairn. He set the folded page beneath a small stone at the base of the arch. The figure watched. "That is not all your proof." "No. Then you do not cross fully." Aldrich looked into the brightness. The longing struck him so sharply that he nearly stepped forward anyway. To see beyond, to know, to answer the question that had drawn him from every familiar road. But he felt the journal in his hands, the promise to Corin, the faces of those who had helped him, and the simple truth that some stories are meant to return, even if they limp home, soaked, tired, and missing several convenient explanations. "I know," Aldrich said. The figure's mist-like face tilted. "You choose return." "I choose to carry the tale back imperfectly." "Why?" Aldrich slipped the journal into its oilskin. "Because someone has to tell the next fool where not to drink." For the first time, the figure laughed. It sounded like rain touching leaves far away. Aldrich put the journal back into his pack. As he did, something changed in the arch. The brightness dimmed, not vanishing, but drawing farther away, like a candle seen through closing doors. He felt grief, real grief, the kind that comes when a life you might have lived turns aside and becomes unreachable. But beneath it lay relief. He had not failed. He had chosen. The blue lights gathered around him. One by one, they sank into the stone terrace, leaving small wet marks that faded quickly. The roar of the falling sea softened, though the water still poured endlessly beyond the cliffs. The figure stepped aside. "Then take no straight road home." Aldrich frowned. Of course not. The margin dislikes straight roads. Naturally. Do not seek the same path. It is no longer yours. That was inconvenient, but unsurprising. At this point, a convenient instruction would have felt suspicious. The figure raised one hand toward the basin high above, though the pillar was hidden by mist. You will remember enough. You will forget enough. Both are needed. Aldrich adjusted his pack. Will anyone believe me? Some. Only some. Enough. That word settled gently. Enough. Not all. Not proof beyond doubt. Not conquest of mystery. Enough. Aldrich bowed, awkwardly, because he was still damp and stiff and unsure of proper etiquette when thanking one of the manners of the world's edge. The figure faded as the mist thickened. Soon only its voice remained. Go, traveler. The world is wider on the way back. Aldrich turned from the arch. Behind him, the brightness beyond the margin receded into silence. Ahead lay the terrace, the cliff path, the wrong stars, the strange sea, and somewhere beyond them, the long, crooked road toward human hearths. He began walking, not as the man who had come seeking the end of the world, not entirely. He walked as a man carrying an unfinished answer, which is heavier, less impressive, and usually more useful. At the top of the first stair, he looked back once. The arch stood empty. The mist drifted through it. The sea fell forever in its hidden thunder. Aldrich touched the blue thread around his wrist, smiled faintly, and followed the cliff path away from the edge. No map could show. Aldrich did not remember leaving the cliffs. That troubled him later. He remembered turning from the arch. He remembered the blue thread on his wrist. He remembered the roar of the falling sea, softening behind him until it seemed less like thunder and more like a memory of thunder. After that, the road became fragments, wrong stars above black water, a stair descending where no stair had been, a white bird passing overhead with a dark seed in its beak, a bell ringing once beneath the sea, then morning, real morning, gray, cold, and ordinary enough to feel miraculous. Aldrich woke on a beach below the lighthouse. Keeper Elian stood over him, holding an unlit lantern. You returned, she said. Aldrich blinked sand from his lashes. Apparently, most do not arrive by sleeping on the shore. I like to be original. Elian helped him sit. His pack lay beside him, soaked but whole. His journal remained wrapped in oilskin. The shell from Old Mara rested in his palm, though he did not remember taking it out. For 3 days, he stayed in the lighthouse. He slept, ate, wrote nothing. That surprised him most. The journal waited beside his bed, but whenever he opened it, words felt too sharp, too small, too eager to pretend they understood. So he closed it again and watched Elian tend the flame. On the 4th day, she asked, Did you reach it? Aldrich looked toward the western mist. Yes. And? He smiled faintly. It was not tidy. Elian nodded, as if this confirmed something important. When he returned to Salomir, the villagers did not cheer. Sensible people rarely cheer for travelers who come back looking thinner, stranger, and smelling faintly of impossible weather. Old Mara touched his sleeve. You listened? When I had sense. So sometimes. Generous estimate. Torvin gave him stew and asked no questions until the bowl was empty. Only then did Aldrich tell them what he could. The islands, the storm, the wrong stars, the cliffs, the arch. Some listened with wonder, some frowned. One fisherman muttered that fog could confuse any man. Aldrich did not argue. proof had remained behind. After all, or some of it. He traveled east when his strength returned. The moor seemed shorter, though not kinder. The marker stones watched him pass. Gisela appeared once on a ridge, nodded at the blue thread still on his wrist, and vanished before he could thank her. Bren met him near the old ridge with Porridge the mule. The mule looked disappointed that Aldrich had survived. Bren studied him. "You found something." "Yes." "The edge?" "An edge," Bren grunted. "That sounds like the answer of a man who has become difficult at supper." Aldrich laughed for the first time in days. Months later, he reached the coastal town, where the old mapmaker still lived among parchment and dust. Aldrich placed his journal on the table. The mapmaker read until his candle guttered low. Then he looked at Aldrich with eyes suddenly less old. "Will they believe this?" "Some. Only some. Enough." So the tale began traveling without Aldrich. Copies of his notes spread between mapmakers, sailors, monks, and merchants. Some preserved his careful warnings. Others improved them terribly. Within a year, one version claimed he had fought a serpent made of moonlight. Another insisted he married the Queen of the Horizon. Aldrich found this especially impressive, since he had not met her. But beneath the nonsense, something true remained. A mapmaker left blank space more respectfully. A sailor avoided bells in fog. A scholar wrote that borders were not failures of knowledge, but invitations to humility. And in quiet rooms beside low fires, people whispered of a traveler who reached the world's margin and returned with no trophy, no shining stone, no captured secret. Only a story, which, inconveniently, was all the edge had allowed. Aldrich never again searched for the final end of the world, but sometimes at dusk he would look west and touch the blue thread around his wrist. Then he would smile, as if hearing far-off water falling forever beyond the maps. And that was enough. The fire grows low now, and the road in the tale grows soft beneath the night. Aldrich's footsteps fade into the hush of remembered shores, past the stones, past the quiet villages, past every strange bell and silver tide. Nothing more needs to be solved. Nothing more needs to be chased. The edge of the world can keep its secrets, and you can let your own thoughts loosen gently, like a cloak unfastened after a long journey. There is only the calm dark, the steady breath, the sense that the roads are resting too. Somewhere far away, a lighthouse flame turns slowly through mist. Somewhere, a quiet sea folds itself beneath unfamiliar stars. Somewhere, a traveler closes his journal and sleeps without needing to prove where he has been. And here, for this moment, you are safe. The night asks nothing difficult of you. It does not need a map. It does not need an answer. It only opens around you, wide and gentle, while the last sounds of the story settle like warm ash. So let the cliffs become clouds. Let the ocean become breath. Let the road become a dream road, smooth and silver, leading nowhere you must hurry to reach. The tale has done its walking for tonight. Now the world is quiet, the horizon is calm, and beyond every distant margin, there is only softness, waiting patiently beneath the stars.